Hi, everyone. I'm Clara Wallace, and I'm the Assistant Director of Talks here at 6th and I. Whether you're here with us in person or watching virtually from home, on behalf of 6th and I and our partner, Politics and Prose Bookstore, thank you for being with us tonight and for your support of a nonprofit and an independent bookstore. By show of hands, is this your first time at 6th and I? Welcome! For those who are new, this building dates back to 1908. It was a synagogue for 45 years and then home to an AME church for the next 50 years. When the church relocated and put the building up for sale in the early 2000s, the highest bid was from someone who wanted to turn it into a nightclub. It was saved within 24 hours, and we recently marked our 20th anniversary as a center for arts, entertainment, ideas, and Jewish life. Just 5 days away from the election, we feel especially fortunate and honored to have the historian Heather Cox Richardson with us this evening. She's here on the occasion of the paperback release of her 7th book, Democracy Awakening: Notes on the State of America, which was an instant New York Times bestseller. The book was also declared magisterial by the Washington Post. In Democracy Awakening, Dr. Richardson shares an urgent call to action about the precarious state of our democracy, charting its historical challenges and what has led to the threats it currently faces. The paperback version also includes a new afterword. The book builds on Letters from an American, Dr. Richardson's wildly popular newsletter, which chronicles current events and situates the news of the day in the long sweep of American history. She does this with clarity and with calm, which sets her work apart, along with how she helps her readers metabolize confounding situations by distilling them to their essence. Dr. Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College. She's written about the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and the American West in award-winning books whose subjects stretch from the European settlement of the North American continent to the history of the Republican Party through the Trump administration. Across her work, Dr. Richardson reminds us that democracy requires constant vigilance and participation from us all. Tonight, she will be in conversation with Charlotte Clymer, a writer, yes? A writer, communications consultant, LGBTQ activist, military veteran, and the founder of the award-winning Substack newsletter, Charlotte's Web Thoughts. In recent years, Charlotte was named to Fortune magazine's 40 Under 40 list of the most influential people in politics and government. Last year, she became the first and only trans member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you all again for joining us. Please help me give Heather Cox Richardson and Charlotte Clymer a warm welcome to 6th and I.
My goodness. Happy Halloween, y'all.
What are you going as?
I, like you, am going off as a pissed off woman who's registered to vote. Goodness gracious. Well, let me start here. When I first read Letters from an American, it was, I want to say, 3 years ago. That sounds right, 3 or 4 years ago. And then I came to Substack as a writer and started my own blog/newsletter. And every day on Substack, they'll have a leaderboard for different verticals. So they'll have it for food and drink, international affairs. They'll have it for business or economics, what have you. And to get on the leaderboard for US politics, which is the top 30 blogs of that day, you have to write a really damn good piece. You really do. I mean, it's quite an achievement just to get on there. This morning, the #1 position was the October 29th, 2024 edition of Letters from an American. And yesterday, the #1 position was the October 28th, 2024 edition of Letters from an American. And on Tuesday, the #1 position was the October 27, 2024 edition of Letters from an American. And this is not an anomaly. For the past several years, Heather Cox Richardson, I think it would be very accurate to describe you as the most widely read historian in the United States.
Which is such an honor. But I'm laughing. First of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you both for Six and I for this beautiful space and for Politics and Prose. Our indie booksellers are the ones who are preserving democracy in this country right now. Huge fan of the indies over here. But this is what's so much fun about this. I don't know what you're talking about, there being a leaderboard.
I know you don't.
So
I know
it's
you
like,
don't.
wow, that's really cool.
It's true, though, but that's part of why people, quite frankly, respect you so highly, but also love you. I mean, we really do. You give us a sense of clarity and hope in a moment of considerable confusion and anxiety, and I would say ignorance. You bring light to a lot of dark places right now, and you don't do it by pandering or by writing to people's biases. You do it with very sober truth.
Well, thank you very much. I think there are a lot of us doing a lot of good work, yourself included.
Thank you.
And I will say that what I think I do, and I've described myself as the coffee pot around which a wonderful community has gathered, that it's really not me. I'm good at research. That's my thing. I'm a very good researcher. And I have become a decent writer, and I will say that there is one person who holds my feet to the fire every single day, and she is here tonight. I could not do it without, and I think I'm allowed to say her name, without Katja Partan, who is here. But all I am doing is I'm saying what everybody else is thinking. And I never forget that I'm just the person who's a mouthpiece for this phenomenal community that is not only the people who read my work, but who read so many of us independent writers now, and I think are changing the country.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I do want to point out that I will not accept that you would call yourself a decent writer. Your humility has no currency here. I'm sorry.
Well, you're right. You know, I had written 6 books when I started the letters, and I'll be honest here, I was a good writer. I always describe myself as a craftsman. You know, you work at a craft long enough, you become good at it, right? But I wasn't an artist, and I'm not being humble there. I was very proud to call myself a craftsman, but I used to say, writing is not an art, it is a craft. I'm a very good craftsperson.
Yes.
And the thing is that around then I was talking to a friend of mine who's a very good writer, and he had an assignment, and we were in the same room, and he sits down, and he's like, and I said, how do you do that? You haven't outlined anything, you don't know what you're going to say? And he looked at me like I had 2 heads, and he said, well, can't you hear the music? And I was like, no, I can't hear the music. There isn't any music, you know? And I have to say, after more than 2 million words in Letters from an American, I hear the music.
Yes.
And that's, there really is music. And if you listen to the letters that I read in the morning, because I read the letters every morning, and I have to laugh because this is so me. The letters are, the spoken word letters are very, very popular. And you know why they're popular? Because apparently they run just as long as it takes to take your dog out and come back. Which just amuses. I mean, if you read the reviews, they're really like, yeah, it's perfect. Fido does his business. I listen to the news. We're good. But I'm very careful in those, and I have a very good sound guy. I'm very careful in those to try and make you hear the music too. And so, I read them very, very carefully to get the rhythm and the sound down. And that's, so now I think I'm certainly a better writer, but that's, again, thanks to you all sticking with me while I learned how to do it.
I have to point this out. I've been a history nerd since I was a kid. I loved history books. I loved reading about, not just American history, but world history. You have a particular gift for writing things that appeal directly to history nerds, but also making history quite accessible to folks who may not be into it. And I don't know anyone else who does it quite in the way you do. I mean, you really do, you contextualize things in such a manner that I've never seen anyone do, and you bring people into the fold rather than making history intimidating. And that's a gift. That's an extraordinary gift.
It must be a gift because I don't do it consciously at all. It's just the inside of my head, and that's the way I grew up. I grew up in a storytelling community because we really didn't have access to, we had TV, but it was a perpetual snowstorm and there were only 3 channels. And we didn't, like, I was saying this to someone the other day. I am extraordinarily immature as somebody who consumes film or TV because I didn't have it. I never learned how to do that. I never learned how to watch movies or to watch television shows. I'm pretty good at the visual arts because we did have that. But you should think of me like literally like a 5th grader when it comes to do movies. Buddy and I were watching a 1920s. He's very good at that stuff, and we were watching one that was actually filmed near where we are in Maine. When we were dating, and after an hour into the movie, I'm like, "Wait, why is he kissing his sister?" And he's like, "Heather, there are 2 couples." I'm like, "Are there? They all look alike." He's like, "Maybe we should watch this again in another time," and we never went back to it, but. I forget where I was going with that.
We got to get drunk together and watch Casablanca someday. I'm just saying. That'd be great.
That's right, exactly.
Yes.
I don't even remember where I was going with that. This is my last stop on a 13-month tour. So it might be brilliant, or you might be like that. I got halfway into that, and I'm like, what was this about? Anyway.
So, this book in particular, it's remarkable in the way that it distills the last 80 years of American political ideology into a way that is so accessible, so readable. As I was going through it, I kept thinking to myself, no one has ever put it quite this way. And what you do is you take things I think that a lot of us kind of feel and know, especially about this moment, and you contextualize it with very crystal clear history. And it's just wonderful to read. I really want to discuss right now the ideological evolution of the past 80 years. Obviously, a lot of parts of that start long before, right? Talk about the history of the word conservative, what that's historically meant, what it means now. How do we get to this point?
Okay, and where I was going before was the idea that I grew up telling stories and making sense of the world through stories. And if you think about human beings, one of the things that really separates us from other species is that we make sense of the passage of time through the stories we tell as individuals, but I also I think as nations, or as a nation. And so much of this is the story of who we are as a nation and how we got here as a nation. So the word conservative, you'll notice if you read me on a daily basis, I only use the word conservative as an ideological proposition. So conservatism in the United States, as you know it today, is not true conservatism. It is an offshoot of the concept of movement conservatism. And what that was the group of people who organized in 1937 to try and overturn the New Deal government, which is the government that regulates business and provides a basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure and protects civil rights. And when they did that, they said they were conservative because they wanted to go back to the 1920s before that. But even at the time, people were like, well, that's not conservatism, that's reactionary radicalism. And they deliberately used the word conservative to make it sound like they were actually ideologically conservative, much the way that the Fox News channel calls itself news when, again, if you, no, I'm quite serious. It is a name. If you look at the terms of use in the second paragraph of the terms of use, which are available online, it says this is for entertainment purposes only. It is not a news channel, but everybody thinks it is because it's got the word news in it. Conservatism as an ideological proposition is a really, really interesting thing. And it's something that didn't come to America very easily because it grows out of the French Revolution. When Edmund Burke, who was actually a big supporter of the American Revolution, was not a supporter of the French Revolution because he looked across the channel and he recognized that people were losing their heads. And he realized that if you're thinking about how you construct a government, what's the government supposed to do? And he argued that if you tried to establish a government based on ideology, it was only a question of time until you tried to make the people fit the ideology rather than the ideology fit the people. And so he said that what the government really should do is to try to conserve elements of stability. Now, in his days, that would be the church, that would be family, that would be aristocracy, that would be the guardrails of a stable society. And of course, that's not at all what the movement conservatives want to do. They wanted to get rid of all the things that create a stable society, and you can see that going on in our lives right now. But that idea of conservatism, and Burkean conservatism, does not really come to America in that period because America is so young there's nothing to conserve, really, and I'm being flippant, but not entirely. It becomes used in America in 1858, really, most strongly, and that happens when after the Compromise of 1850, which is the one that has the Fugitive Slave Act in it, the Northerners say, we are not going to honor the Fugitive Slave Act, which says that the federal government can force us to turn our neighbors over to men who claim to own them. The way the law was written, black Americans had no say in whether or not they were considered actually enslaved. So they said, we're not going to honor that law. And the elite enslavers looked at the Northerners and said, well, you're radicals because you're not honoring the law. And abolitionists looked at that and said, now hang on just a minute. We're the conservatives. We're trying to conserve the government from before the way it was when you said the federal government could come take away our black neighbors. And it's really Abraham Lincoln who in 1858 makes this go national when he's talking in the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. Douglas keeps trying to call him a radical, and he keeps saying, now hang on just a minute. I am standing on the Declaration of Independence. I am standing on the idea that everybody should be treated equally before the law, and he doesn't talk about having a right to a say in their government. You are the ones who keep saying that we're going to make human enslavement become a national institution. We, the Republicans, are the conservatives. And so if you've heard me describe myself as a Lincoln Republican or as a conservative, as I often do, I'm standing squarely with Lincoln. I am standing on the Declaration of Independence that says that the law must treat everybody equally and we all should have a right to a say in our government. That is the conservative position in America. And that's not what the movement conservatives are all about. They're Absolutely. For the opposite of that, to overturn that, but that's like, the Fox News Channel.
I'm going to be nerdy for a second. Can you talk about the Cooper Union speech a little bit?
I'm sorry?
The Cooper Union speech, Lincoln's speech at Cooper Union.
Sure, the Cooper
Union. Just a little bit.
So the Cooper, do you have is there a reason you like that one?
It's the speech that made him president.
Why do you say that?
It's the one that all the Northerners thought he was some, country bumpkin, and he came in there and just blew them away with logic and a very firm, righteous confidence.
Has anybody been inside Cooper Union in New York? So some of you have. My friend Joanne and I were walking through New York last year, and all of a sudden we were at Cooper Union, and we were like, I guess I didn't know it still existed. And we were so excited, and we went to go in, and they're like, we're sorry, you can't just walk in here. And we're like, but, and they wouldn't let us in.
But I'm Heather Cox Richardson.
No. But it was very cool. So the Cooper Union speech is really interesting because you're exactly right. Lincoln was thought to be a Western country bumpkin. He had a very high voice. He was perceived at the time as being an ugly man. Tastes change. If you're ever interested, look up Roscoe Conkling from the period after that. He was perceived as being the handsomest man in America. Just saying. But Lincoln recognized that when he came to talk in New York, he was going to need to make it clear that he had a brain as well as a following in the West. And so he begins the Cooper Union speech with a very sort of dry recitation, or seemingly dry recitation, of the history of the United States. And what he does in the midst of that speech is he does exactly that. He says, you are starting to make this argument, you Southern enslavers, that the country is based in human enslavement, but it is not. And I am the conservative, and he's defending himself against people from the right flank, like William Henry Seward, who said, basically we should throw out the Constitution and get rid of enslavement altogether. He's saying, no, I'm not saying that. I am standing on the Constitution. And by the time he finished that speech, you're exactly right. A lot of people in the East who had thought, oh, he's either a weenie or he's stupid or any of those things, were willing to sign on, recognized how spectacular he was. It's also, right before that, that's when Matthew Brady, right before he went to the Union, he had Matthew Brady photograph him. And of course, it was Mary Todd Lincoln, who was really the one who had the political eye. He did not. He was very good with a group of men, told great stories, off-color stories, a lot of them. But he wasn't good in social situations that included women, which is what so much of politics has always been. She was the one who would tell him how to dress, and we could talk about her all night. She's a fascinating character. But he went to Matthew Brady, and it had always been a big deal that he was so tall and that he looked gangly and awkward. And people, if you look at earlier photos, he tried to hide that. And it was Matthew Brady who pulled his sleeves back and said, we need people to see how big your hands are. We need to position you as somebody who is big coming out of the West, as opposed to somebody small trying to hide in the East. And I've always loved that Matthew Brady portrait, because you can see he's got his hand open and down on a few books.
Giant hands.
He had huge hands, yeah.
Big man. Okay, so...
That was a rabbit hole, but...
No, this is exactly what I wanted.
It's Halloween,
This is great. So this book is about 3 inflection points. We're at the first inflection point, the Civil War. How does what happened in the Civil War inform what we're seeing today?
Well, there are many ways in which I think that is a foundational moment for the United States. So, actually, you know what? Why don't you tell me what you think first, so I know where to bounce off of it.
Well, Reconstruction was decidedly a failure. But I think what I look back on is, even with all of the awfulness that you saw in that time, the rhetoric was so grand and expansive, and people weren't afraid to have conversations. Big conversations, folks gathering for hours to hear politicians speak as a form of entertainment, rather than what we have now, which you have presidential candidates getting in garbage trucks and driving them around.
But come on. Who thought it was a good idea to write Trump on the side of a garbage truck?
God.
Honest to God, I was flying somewhere, and the minute the plane came down, I turned on my phone, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, tomorrow's Halloween, so somebody's done this, and it's really kind of funny. And then they had the Getty picture of him, and I thought, oh, that's not very nice. They've gone a little far. And then I saw more, and I thought, oh my God, this appears like it might be real. And then I'm like, oh man, like somebody, I'm speechless. I've got a great idea. I'll take my candidate for president and put him in a garbage truck and put his name on the side of the garbage truck. I was speechless.
His campaign manager is being paid, I think, $23 million.
Hey, I would have done that for...
Touché. Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, I had the same reaction you did. I've been working all week, just mired in election stuff, and I opened up Twitter, and I saw the picture, and I had the exact same reaction. I thought, okay, that's kind of a tacky meme. And then I kept scrolling, and I saw another one, and I'm like, what is going on? And it's true. Like he looks like a clown. So it's unfortunate. But no, going back to the Civil War, it's such an interesting period because you see these competing ideologies, obviously, but people do engage with each other. Not everyone, obviously. I don't mean to suggest that, but these great leaders are engaging with each other on at least the presumption of good faith, right? There's less spin. There's more direct. Here's how I feel. Here's why you are wrong. You have Thaddeus Stevens calling, the opposition leader, a great hunk of mess or whatever on the House floor when they're debating the amendment, 13th Amendment. So it's very interesting to me to look back at that time and see what good faith engagement looked like. Very imperfect good faith engagement, don't get me wrong, but at least people were far more honest in what they were saying, because now it seems like there is a lot of spin, a lot of triangulation, a lot of doublespeak. Certainly if you look at the last 20 years in Republican politics, with who is the old campaign manager from Reagan and Bush? What is his name? Thank you. Yes. He basically wrote a strategy that says, well, we're going to be less openly racist and more obliquely racist.
Yeah.
Right.
So there are two separate things there. One fascinates me, and I often say how much I love the 1920s. And one of the reasons I love the 1920s is because politicians did exactly what you said. Politicians have always spun. But until the 1920s, they would say, Andrew Mellon actually says, when the Depression hits, well, we just got to let it all crash. And lots of people die. And, and things will get really bad, but then everything will be better afterward. And he says it openly. And politicians say what they are thinking, and there's really no filter. And it makes for very open discussions. That ceased to be the case in the United States in the 1950s. And it ceased to be the case because those people who wanted to destroy the government, wanted to destroy this New Deal government, were recognized that this system was popular. So instead of saying, hey, they actually tried that for a while. They said, we're going to go back to the 1920s and everything's going to be so much better. And people are looking at them and going like, we were living in packing boxes. We don't want to go back to the 1920s. So you got the rise of people like William F. Buckley Jr. with his, God Man at Yale, The Superstition of Academic Freedom, which said that, in fact, you should not have free and open discussion for debate to move the country in a good direction and let people choose. You should simply tell people that they have to start from a premise of individualism and Christianity, and that's just the way it's going to be. And you see this increasing focus on feeding people a myth and getting them to buy into that myth until you have, nowadays, it just kills me when you talk to people and say that the current day MAGA Republicans, who are not our traditional Republicans, are going after Social Security and Medicare. And people will say, that's a lie. They say they're not going to do it. And I'm like, it's in writing, right here in the Republican Study Group. Or Trump out there today saying that this was a complete lie, that he was going after Obamacare. And it's like, you had an executive order that did that. You had a party in the Rose Garden when the House overturned it. It's in your freaking platform. And yet he'll go out there and say, this isn't the case. So that's a big change that you see in the 1920s through the 1950s. And I agree with you. You can't have a real discussion when you don't have people who can agree on basic facts.
That's right.
The Civil War, I think, although people are much more open about what they're doing, the parallels that I see there and that I find fascinating are that you see the same sort of fight that we have going on now, a very small minority, because it's really the elite enslavers in the American South, which make up less than 1% of the population, who are really pushing the idea of making enslavement national. And they know they're a small minority. And so they decide they're going to protect their interests and spread human enslavement by taking over the White House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court, which sounds, familiar? And you have, opposed to that, people who come together to say that they believe in democracy. And they're a really wide spectrum of people. And that's what this moment looks like to me, that contest between those people who believe that some people are better than others and have the right to rule, and those people who believe that we should all be treated equally before the law and have a right to a say in our government. And one of the things that interests me about that in this moment is that, as you say, Reconstruction, I would not necessarily call it a failure, but it certainly did not turn out the way that big body of small d Democrats wanted it to turn out. But one of the things that's so interesting to me about Reconstruction is just exactly what you say. There's all these new voices. You know, did you know that we had hundreds and hundreds of black newspapers in Reconstruction? We had indigenous newspapers. We had new music. We have the cowboys. The cowboys moving Western music out of Texas. We have
formerly enslaved in Congress.
Yes. And you have this new clothing and new music and new trade and more inventions coming more rapidly than in any other period in American history. I mean, it's just this incredibly exciting period where nobody knows how it's all going to come out, and everybody has a say. And what always impresses me, and one of the reasons I ended up in working largely in the 19th century, is because this giant mix of people and languages and ideas and literature and music and clothing and foreign affairs and all that ends up creating the progressive era. Yes. And that feels like, to me, really where we are.
Yeah, it's a fun time. Tell me more about, basically, first of all, Teddy Roosevelt, one of my favorite presidents.
What do you like about him?
Oh my God. I love that he didn't give a shit.
Yeah, it's really true.
I really do.
Do you know that thing about the man in the arena?
Yes.
Do you know Elvis had that over his desk at Graceland? I think that's fascinating.
No, I didn't know
Isn't that cool?
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
Elvis only showed up for one award that he got, and it was the Young Man's, Young Man of the Year thing. I'm sorry, I'm tired, I'm not getting this right. Elvis is such an interesting character because I think he really modeled himself after people like Nixon. We know he went to visit Nixon in the White House, and like Teddy Roosevelt. But when I saw that over his desk, I was like, really?
That is crazy. For those who don't know what this is, it's a very short speech in which Teddy Roosevelt talks about the great risk and great glory that comes into entering the public arena and taking a stand and daring to do great things. And it's not the critic who counts, it's the man who stands in the arena. Obviously, he's talking in the 1920s verbiage, so we're not getting, a lot of women in this picture. But, he's talking about the fact that, yes, it does take great risks to do great things. And yes, you will be pilloried. You will have a lot of horrible critics who throw stones at you, but it is worth it. And there is great honor even in going into the arena and failing if you're at least making the effort to dare greatly. Yeah. And it's so beautiful. And that encapsulates his life, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you like him because
I like him because all throughout his life, whether it was NYPD, when he was commissioner of the NYPD, when he was governor of New York, I obviously don't agree with starting the Spanish-American War because, there was a lot of unethical machinations behind it. But you see at every point in his life when he gets this notion that something needs to be done, and then he just goes and does it against great odds, against the crowd often who thought that he was being overzealous or nonsensical or naive. And he would really, I think, wrangle together bright minds and just go make it happen. And I think in some ways it reminds me of LBJ, right? They kind of share similarities in that kind of manner. What do you think?
I think that's really interesting because what LBJ, they're very larger than life personalities, but LBJ could get stuff through Congress and Teddy Roosevelt couldn't. So here again, end of a tour, tired. Here's my Teddy Roosevelt story. I'm not a huge Teddy Roosevelt fan because he's just all about Teddy Roosevelt. But I love this. I told this to my friend Joanne. We just did a thing together last night, which is why she's on my mind. I think I've mentioned her before. And she goes, "Oh man, you're going to make me like Teddy Roosevelt, aren't you?" He used to go home from The Office when he was in the White House. And in his era, we had just gotten celluloid. I always forget which one it is. The film and the stuff they made buttons out of, you get the first toys made out of it. Does anyone remember? Celluloid, is that it? It's one of the cellu-somethings. And he used to bring home horses for his kids, whatever it is, horses for his kids. And he had for each of them, he took pins, the dressmaker's pins, and took pliers and bent them into little brands for each child. And he would heat that in a candle, and he would brand the horses for his children so they had their own. Isn't that sweet? It's just him taking that personality and bringing it home. I just love that story.
My other favorite story about his kids is Alice Roosevelt. So Alice was very much like, I am not going to do what's expected of me as a young woman in that time. She just did whatever she wanted, and everyone else could deal with it, much like her father. And she once interrupted a cabinet meeting, and there were complaints. And he said, listen, I can either run the country or I can control Alice. I can't possibly do both.
That's right.
Oh, I love that. That's good stuff. But yeah, no, LBJ, before he had his meteoric rise and became Senate Majority Leader, the Senate was essentially a non-functioning body for a long time. In fact, the Senate Majority Leader was more of, I would even call it an honorary title, right? There wasn't really much power there until he came in and made the body in his own image.
My favorite LBJ picture is there's a picture of him. He's a very big man, and he's trying to he put such pressure on people to do stuff. And there's this little man who is LBJ wants him to do something, and the man is standing against the wall like this, and he's looking up at him. And if this is the little man, LBJ's like this, and you can be like, that guy's going to do it. He's going to have to do what LBJ says. But yet, look what he accomplished,
Oh my gosh. A very, very complicated man, to be sure. I certainly think you can look back and there are any number of things to criticize about him, but we certainly would not be where we are in terms of progress were it not for his willingness to go against the grain, particularly Southern Democrats, and essentially, in their minds, betray them in passing civil rights legislation, in pushing for progressive goals across the board. He is a fascinating, I think probably the most fascinating, maybe more than FDR, to be honest with you. I think LBJ is maybe more fascinating than FDR.
Yeah, he took the power he had and he ran with it. Now, I think you could argue, see what you think of this, I think you could argue that we are today, or at least we're with the election of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, seeing the outcome of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Because with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which LBJ managed to get through Congress with the help of both Democrats and Republicans, he really forced America to grapple with the idea of a multicultural democracy. That's 65. Now, 64, the Republicans had already begun to swing toward the idea of an all-white party with Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. The 65, you get the Voting Rights Act, and then you've got 68 coming up, the presidential election of 68, and it's not clear who's going to do what. And then in 68, this is when we get Richard Nixon saying we're going to go with the Southern strategy, in which I say to Southern people or Southern leaders like Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, that I will not use the federal government to enforce desegregation. And then I will allow, the South to sort of move itself back toward home rule. And at the same time, the Democrats in 68 really try and open up the process, and they get the Democratic National Convention in Chicago of that year, which is a problem.
Yes.
For a number of reasons. It's sort of interesting. The hall it was supposed to be in had a fire, so they moved it closer to Mayor Daley's house. Not a good move. But there was a lot going on in 68. But what you get from that is the attempt of the Democrats to reorganize how they are going to have nominations, make them more open for different people, but also try and make sure that you don't get chaos again. So in 72, they try and reorganize in such a way that they have more representation in the party for nominations, the person who's in charge of that committee is George McGovern. George McGovern then becomes the nominee that year, and once again, it doesn't go very well. And for those of you who don't know, he ends up not even getting his own home state of South Dakota. He ended up getting Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. alone. So it's a landslide for Nixon and Agnew in '72. But after that, the Democrats seemed to me to sort of say, we made a mistake, we got to get back the white voters. And they had not had, Democrats have not had the majority of the white male vote since 1964, but after '72, they start trying to get it again. So the Republicans go down that road that they ended up with now, which is that they are literally now have been taken over by fascists. And the Democrats were sort of trying to be like, we're gonna get back those white voters. And it seemed to me that one of the really amazing things about the Biden administration or the Biden election was he was like, all right, I'm done playing this game. My base is black Americans, and I'm going to represent women and black Americans in the base of my party and put together a new kind of coalition. And Kamala Harris, I think, is running with that and changing it her own way. But in some ways, it seems like what we're really seeing today is the ultimate play out of the '65 Voting Rights Act.
Yes, couldn't agree more. And really, oh yeah, please.
I was just saying I'm working on a new book, and I thought about writing that book because it's interesting, right? If you think about it that way, that's
incredibly interesting.
And I thought, I cannot write another book about the Republicans. I just can't do it. So that's it. It could have been a book, but look, I just saved y'all $25.
I'd say with the exception of Clinton in '92, he wins a few states in the South. But with the exception of him, Jimmy Carter is the last time that Democrats do well in the South, and it hasn't been that way since. Almost 50 years now. Goodness gracious, 48 years.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter, man.
And now yes, please.
So you may not know this. I know you do know this. The State Department has online a series of what the foreign affairs scholars think are the most important events of each president's tenure. And the Carter years are just fascinating. They are just fascinating. Because, of course, he's trying to do something really different with foreign affairs than Nixon and Kissinger did. And it kind of got forgotten because then America went on and had a bunch of wars and all that. But he's really interesting in foreign affairs.
The Camp David summit. I mean, that was a huge milestone, not just in these Middle East, but really globally. Yeah. And it really sets the tone, I think, for presidential foreign policy for the next couple decades. So Jimmy Carter was such an underrated president. He really was. I will go to my grave saying that.
I'm with you on that one.
He was. Okay, so we only got 20 minutes left, and I want to contextualize the last 40 years, because we get... This is the only thing a nerd would say. I'm so sorry. We get the Reagan Revolution. Reagan sweeps in with the Southern Baptists, the religious right. What happens next?
So this, I think, is really... I mean, this is such an interesting moment in American history, because Reagan does sort of sweep in for a number of reasons, in part because he's doing exactly what you alluded to before. He is not operating in reality, and a lot of the press could not cover him because they kept saying, well, he's lying.
I've never heard this before.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you can just look at, he talked a lot about how when he was a lifeguard, he'd saved hundreds and hundreds of people, and all the other lifeguards are like, well, they never drown on our watch. Why are you saving all these people? And he just got away with it.
He lied about being a football star as well in high school. Yeah, Reagan lied a lot. Yeah.
Well, he had that fantasy world, and he sold that fantasy world, which itself is a whole conversation. But he promised Americans that they could cut taxes and still retain the social welfare programs that they enjoyed and that they liked, because cutting taxes would increase it would make the economy boom such that more and more taxes would come in. So you could both have all kinds of public services and not pay taxes. And David Stockman, this is a fascinating thing. David Stockman was his director of management and budget, was so convinced that this would work, that he had quite unvarnished conversations with a journalist from The Atlantic, which are available online if you want to read them. It became a book called The Education of David Stockman, but it's also a series of Atlantic articles which do not have a paywall over them. And Stockman fed into the computers at OMB what they were going to do, and this was going to get rid of the budget deficits, and everything was going to be rosy. And the computers said, you're going to just explode the debt. So what did? They reprogrammed the computers. I'm not kidding. I'm totally not kidding. So by 18, 19, so what happens is Reagan wants these big tax cuts. Doesn't look like he's going to get them through Congress because everybody is like, that ain't going to work, dude. And then, of course, he is shot. And if you remember this, some of you may, the first thing he does after the assassination attempt is he makes a plea for this tax cut. And that's when his popularity was through the roof, and nobody wanted to say, well, we're not going to give it to you. So we get the 81 tax cuts. But by 86, it's pretty clear that Americans don't like what Reagan is doing. They don't like the cuts. They don't like the language. They don't like this stuff. So what we see in 86, I think, really sets up where we are today. We get a focus on ballot integrity. It's the first attempt we have to address this idea that there is voter fraud in America. Voter fraud is and has always been, since the late 19th century, vanishingly rare. What we do have in America, on occasion, is election fraud, and that is an entirely different thing. Voter fraud is a voter trying to steal a ballot or vote illegally. Election fraud is people in power trying to steal an election. And that we've had coups in America. We have Wilmington in 1898. We got all these different places where the election system can be in trouble. But voter fraud is extremely rare.
Yeah.
So that's 86. We also in 86 get Edwin Meese, who is Reagan's Attorney General, saying that he is going to make sure that the Reagan Revolution can never be overturned no matter what the American people want. And he's going to do that by putting federal judges in place who believe in the Reagan Revolution. And this is when we start to get the politicization of the DOJ. I'm not the DOJ, of the federal justice system. So if you start from those two premises, what you see is the attempt of this small group of people who want to get rid of that government and take us back to the 1920s. And they do so first by trying to get rid of some of the voters that don't like that, but also then by empowering the racist voters that came from the former Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and also by bringing in the Southern Baptists who have split away from the modernizing Southern Baptists to the much more traditional Southern Baptists. And I think that's what you're seeing today. I mean, one of the things that just, talking before, one of the things that just astonishes me, and I think people are starting to pay attention to it, I might even write about it tonight, is the extraordinary misogyny of this campaign. And that did not start with the Access Hollywood tape. That came through the emphasis of the Southern Baptists, who, remember, as recently as 1925, were saying that we shouldn't have evolution taught in schools. They went directly into the Anti-New Deal coalition in 1937, and they don't get a lot of attention until after 1972, when this is 72, this is the year before Roe v. Wade, Nixon recognizes that he has lost his middle-class supporters because of Kent State in May of 1970, when college students get shot at Kent State, and Nixon and Agnew are very ham-handed in the way they respond, and they sound as if they are accusing the college students of being the perpetrators. And that really decimates Nixon's support among the fathers, the baby boom fathers. And when that happens, Pat Buchanan, who is still alive, by the way.
Yes, he is. And supported President Obama, by the way, ironically. Yeah.
Really? He must be 610.
Yeah.
I mean, more power to him. I'm sorry if you're watching, sir. He said, you can make that up by going after the Catholic vote, the working class Catholic Democrats. And that happens in 1972, the year before Roe v. Wade. People think there was a backlash to Roe. There was not. There was this idea that you could get people on board, not by focusing on fetuses or babies, but by focusing on women who wanted to work outside the home. The idea of preserving that traditional patriarchy. And that's in 72, and then of course by 79 you've had a split in the Southern Baptists, so that part of it is modernizing, but part of it is going in this traditional, much more traditional route. And they're the ones, the Jerry Falwells and all the Pat Robertsons, who support Reagan in 80. And the more that that minority needed support, the more they doubled down, both on the racists and on those traditional evangelicals. And as the evangelicals have become more and more and more and more important in that voting base, they've more and more and more emphasized that idea of a patriarchal system in which women are subservient to men. And now you even have people saying that we should take away the right for women to vote, and that you should have a family vote, or even Jesse Waters this morning on the Fox News channel saying that if his wife voted differently than he did, he would consider that the same as having an affair. I mean, it's a really interesting moment. It's an interesting moment. So much was laid in there, but once again, it's kind of taken us off this cliff, and I think the rest of us are finally getting together and saying, no.
No. Hell no.
We will not go back.
No. Hell no. I'm also struck by what you just said there, because it's crazy how we go from the early 70s, where Nixon has tentative support for the Equal Rights Amendment, and then by the end of the decade, conservatives have basically killed it by weaponizing, starkly religious homes, and saying that women have one role in life, it's to be a homemaker, led by Phyllis Schlafly, who is not a homemaker, but we won't get into that. It's remarkable how fast that transition happened in the conservative movement. It was really overnight in terms of in timeline. Yeah,
it happens very, very quickly. It really does. And one of the things that the Reagan people weaponized so effectively, I think, is the image of the American cowboy. I talk about this all the time, I know, but I think it's really important because what they do is they pick up this idea. And if you think about Reagan, my favorite picture of Reagan is him in that cowboy hat. The one, it's a beautiful picture. But he very deliberately uses that image of the cowboy, and the cowboy comes out of the period after Reconstruction. One of the things I like to say is that, probably many of you could not name a labor leader from that period, which is such an important era in labor. And you might have one or two Black American leaders that you can think of for that period, and maybe a woman or two. What you all know is the American cowboy. And the American cowboy rises in America in 1866, and he operates until about 1886, when there's a number of things that kill off the cattle herds. And we now know, of course, that a third of the cowboys are men of color. But when they begin to do the cattle drives to, by the way, army installations, for all that you don't see that in most of the movies, the Southern former Confederates grab hold of the idea that these are the real Americans, because they're young men who don't have anything but a gun and a horse, and they want the federal government to leave them alone. 1866, the reason they're talking about that is because they are talking about how the federal government is protecting Black Americans through the use of tax dollars. And that, they say, is a form of socialism. So the cowboy becomes the antidote to federal government socialism. And that idea of, a white guy out west with subservient people of color around him and women who are either mothers or sex workers has within it, it's very much when Reagan talked about it, he talks about taxes and we don't want the federal government doing this and on and on and on. But embedded in that is both the racism and the sexism of the Reconstruction years.
Welfare mothers, another big term that was popularized by Reagan.
Absolutely, absolutely, the welfare queen. And one of the things that I really love about the West in that period is that if you were really going to survive in the American West, ever, it wasn't by being a cowboy, it was by having kinship networks, by having communities, by having education. I mean, if you if you think about the populist movement, for example, that's part of the West, but if you ever are in Iowa and you get a chance to go to the State House, it's fascinating because the State House images of what are in their minds at the beginning of the 20th century, the best parts of the American West, they're overwhelmingly women. Women represent that society, and of course they're written out by the cowboy.
I gotta be honest, whenever I see a man say that he wanted to be a cowboy, I just think to myself, no, you don't.
That's right.
You don't want to struggle out west and having to cook your own food every night and riding horseback everywhere. You would be such a weenie. It's not even funny. So, anyway, I want to read you this quick passage that you wrote because it punched me in the face when I first read it. It's on page 61. You wrote, "The country was shifting away from democracy in other ways too. In February 1986, a 35-year-old lawyer for the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice offered up a plan to revise the lawmaking power the Constitution gave to Congress, giving the president more authority. He claimed that the president should not simply sign or veto a law passed by Congress, but shape the law as he wished." Who is that lawyer?
Isn't that astonishing?
Yeah.
He's a young lawyer in the Department of Justice, and his name is Samuel Alito. Yeah. I mean, the weird thing I think about this book for me is that it was such a small group of people doing this stuff. And it's weird, like when I was beside myself over the signing statements. What Alito was setting up with that memo under Reagan was the idea that the executive branch could claw away from the legislative branch its power to make laws by letting Congress do whatever it wanted, and then the president would issue signing statements saying how he would interpret the law. And I remember, and this was written in the Reagan years, and of course, nobody really paid much attention because he had Reagan try it with an appropriations bill, something.
Yeah.
It was something that nobody was really paying attention to. We started to notice under George W. Bush, especially with the torture law, when under an appropriations bill, John McCain and a number of other people got together and said, America will not engage in torture. And Bush had a signing statement in which he said, my job is to keep the American people safe, and I will do whatever I want, essentially. And I remember being beside myself over that, and people being like, yeah, whatever. And one of the things that when people talk about why do I still maintain hope, that's what I think of. Because I remember saying to people, you don't understand. The executive branch is overturning the ability of Congress to make the laws. And people really were just like, yeah, whatever, you're a nerd. And now, if that happened, people would push back and they would say, this is not the way things are supposed to be.
Amen.
Although I will say, one of the things that also jumped out in there was the idea not only of clawing the power to make law away from the Congress and giving it to the president, but clawing it away from the Congress and giving it to the courts. Because Mitch McConnell in 2007, when he became Senate Minority Leader, very clearly stopped the Congress from legislating by weaponizing the filibuster, and then simply decided he would make law by throwing cases to a federal judiciary that had been packed with movement conservative supporters, enabling people like Matthew Kaczmarek in Texas to make law for the rest of the country. And that, if you look even at the Donald Trump versus United States decision of July of this year that said that the president could not be prosecuted for crimes committed as part of his official duties and enjoyed the presumption of immunity for other duties as well. And people always say, why doesn't Joe Biden just go do whatever he wants then? If you read that carefully, it doesn't give blanket immunity. It says the president has this immunity, but since we don't know what that looks like, it's the courts that are going to decide what the immunity is, which to me was just a judicial coup.
Yes. It absolutely is.
And that's our boy Sam.
Oh my God. I remember when he was nominated and it seemed like, okay, this guy is pretty conservative, but the media at the time, I think I was 18. Yeah, I was 18. 18 at the time he was nominated, and it felt like political media said, well, yes, he is a little conservative, but he's a rational conservative. He's going to engage with reason. He's going to have good faith conversations about the law. And I don't know, I look at the last 3 decades especially in terms of our political media, and it just seems like it's been largely a failure over and over again.
Well, I have a question for you on that. Do you think, I mean, one of the things that jumps out to me, I was going to say, there's just these, Paul Manafort is running around with Nixon. Roger Stone is running around with Nixon. Lee Atwater is running around with Nixon. I wonder to what degree, and we can talk about the media, but to what degree we dropped the ball on fascism because we thought that people were operating in good faith. And that they would make good decisions without recognizing that there are some people in this world and in this country who really believe they have the right to rule. And they've been working on doing that now for a pretty long time. You think?
I think so, yeah. I think so.
Because I don't think Alito changed his spots. I think he was always this.
No, he didn't. You're right. I think it speaks to just this calcified system in which people in different spheres of power, whether it be politics, business, media, what have you, really do kind of, I don't want to say collude because that sounds like but it is kind of collusion. Yeah, no. I mean, it does seem like, an inter-enabling that is on a grand scale that gets swept under the rug when it's not favorable to those in power. And it happens again and again and again. And then when something horrific happens, say January 6th, there is almost this sense from a lot of those in these spheres of power that say, oh, well, this has nothing to do with me. I didn't do this. Yeah. God, I'm as shocked as you are. My goodness. I won't be too critical here, but it does feel like some Republican leaders who now say that Trump is a threat to democracy were not so vocal when he did show who he was at the beginning of his 2016 campaign, and we were trying to tell them, no, this guy's awful, what are you talking about? And they said, oh, no, he's being funny, he's joking. He's not really going to engage or embark upon this litany of abuses that he jokes about. I don't know, maybe I sound cynical right now, but...
Well, I actually had the opportunity to talk to somebody who was very involved in the George W. Bush administration and some of the stuff I was talking about. And I had to ask, I said, did you really not see this? I mean, be honest with me, did you really not see what was happening? Because people like me couldn't not see it, and you kept saying that we were overreacting, and we were un-American, and we were all these things. And it was a really interesting answer because he said, you gotta understand, Heather, we were young, we were in these motorcades, people were yelling and cheering for us. It just felt like we were on top of the world, and that anybody who didn't want to be part of that was sort of un-American. And I thought that was not the answer I expected. I expected more like, well, we believed in this, and he was just like, the vibe was so with us.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, it was weird.
I want you to read a passage from your book, but first, let's do some audience questions.
I'm sorry, what's that?
I want you to read a passage from your book, but first, let's do some audience questions, because you got a lot of great questions here. You know what? I left the copy in the green room in which we had circled some questions.
Well, whatever. We're good.
But we'll let it rip.
It's Thursday night. The crowd picks the set, right?
That's right. Amen. Let me see here. I kind of like this one. From Julietta. Should Kamala Harris win, will you continue with your letters?
Oh, that's an easy one. I thought I was over here prepping like, oh my God. So here's the story with the letters. They began organically because people like you wanted them. I did not set out to do it. If you remember, this was not on my radar screen. I was finishing the book before this one. I was moving. I was teaching full time. And I wrote on Facebook, and people just swarmed me with questions. And then I wrote again on Facebook, and that was more than 5 years ago. They began because people needed me to be there in that minute. You will not always need me, and the day will come when we all recognize that it's time for me to move on, and that I don't know what that's going to be. It's not going to be this year, I don't expect. Because no matter what happens on the 5th, the country, I mean, the country is changing, and it could change in a really bad direction. It could also change in an amazing direction. And to have the opportunity to be part of this, and also to have a little bit of a finger on the scale. I mean, one of the things that bothers me these days is that some of the pundits keep saying, well, you know, a new President Harris could really make points by pardoning Donald Trump. And I got to tell you, I feel so strongly about that because, of course, I maintain that the reason we are where we are is because Jefferson Davis and none of the elite enslavers who led us into the Civil War ever paid a penalty for it. And Nixon, had Ford forced Nixon to go through a trial, he'd not even be convicted necessarily, because we don't know, we would not have had the Iran-Contra affair, we would not have had weapons of mass destruction, and I don't think Trump ever would have run for office.
Amen.
So I feel like in the short term, I'm here, but my ultimate goal is for people to decide they don't need me anymore. Because, you know, if things go well, you can do all this for yourselves. And that's kind of the ultimate goal. I'm both a mom and a teacher, and that's the ultimate goal of a mom and a teacher, right? Is to be invisible, is to say you're on your own now. So I'm not going to do it forever, and especially if Buddy is watching, I'll stop soon. But no, I'm not going to stop immediately.
Amen. I love that. Music's my ears. By the way, I want to mention the question you just answered was going to be asked by Roz. So thank you, Roz, for asking that question about President
I knew
Ford.
it was in there.
Yes. Being a student of history, being a scholar of history, being a lover of history, when the vice president does win on Tuesday, and I firmly believe she will win, I think maybe I have a different historical perspective than you do. And I'm curious, what is it going to mean to you on Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever it's official that Vice President Harris has won? I am not jinxing, I promise. I'm going to knock on wood right here. Yeah. But listen, folks, if we do everything we're supposed to do over the next 5 days, she will be elected. She will. Stop wringing your hands. Stop getting anxious. Go out and do the damn work, and she will win. Yeah, that's how it is.
That's actually right.
Yeah.
So my answer may surprise you. I have a profound faith in American democracy, as you know, for sure. And it has been on the ropes now for a long time. If you read all the way back to my dissertation, you will see that all of my books have been about the dangers of trying to impose an ideology on a people from a minority, that this is an incredibly dangerous thing to do, and I always felt like I was sort of shouting into the cyclone. And it was worrisome. I mean, it was really worrisome. And January 2016, the election was horrific for people like me, because it's not just about who's in office. I thought I was watching the death of American democracy. But the day after Trump was inaugurated, the Women's March said to me, something is changing. And for me, you know, one of the most profound moments of the last nightmare years was, of course, January 6th. And my take on it was that it was not only an assault on our current government and on the process of our current government, but on our history and who we are, and on American democracy. And for me, it was that guy carrying the Confederate flag into the White House, the Confederate battle flag, not the White House, into the Capitol, the Confederate battle flag into the Capitol. Because, of course, for me, the White House is a symbol of the people. That's right. You know, it's the people. And I said the White House again, the Capitol is the people's house, right? It's the seat of our government. And in our whole history, it had always been safe. And when I saw that Confederate battle flag, I thought about Julia Ward Howe, who's a woman in our history, that I really adore. She was a thinker and a poet in Massachusetts in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and actually she's the reason we have Mother's Day, which is a different story. But she was in an abusive marriage, and her husband was horrible. This is one of my pet peeves. He used to tell her that nobody would remember her. He was the one with brains, and everybody would remember him, and he was always going to be famous. So I work her into every conversation I can, and I never mention his name. But they were in Washington in 1861 after the war had broken out, and after the first Battle of Bull Run, it looked as if the Confederates were going to be able to invade Washington and take the capital. And so the U.S. troops come into Washington, but Washington is a swamp. I mean, there's nothing here. It's all dirt roads. They're still building the Capitol, and the Treasury Department literally is a chair and a desk, and the government is really not complete yet. So the soldiers don't have really barracks or anything. So around the Capitol, they are in rings around the Capitol, and they have their little rings of soldiers that are encamped there, and they go out in the day and they go out to do a tour of the soldiers, and they come back that evening, and her friends say to Mrs. Howe, they say, you should write something epic, because they're listening to the soldiers singing that they're going to hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree, that old hymn, but they've got new words to it. They're going to hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree. And she's like, well, I want to do something great, but I don't know what it's going to be. My husband's too old to go to war. My sons are too young, and I'm busy with little kids, so I can't help like I'd like to. She goes to bed in one of the hotels in Washington and wakes up at dawn and writes down the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Now, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And she writes it on scrap paper that she's had, and she can't turn the light on because she's got a baby asleep with her, and she doesn't want to wake the baby. But the second verse of that is, I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. So she's looking out at these rings of soldiers around the Capitol. And for that entire war, the Confederates never broke those lines. Mm-hmm. And on January 6th, 2021, encouraged by a president of the United States, that Confederate battle flag flew in the U.S. Capitol. And I will never forgive that. I will never forgive that. So when I think about her being elected, I think about us taking back the people's house and making sure those people never, ever get a chance to do that again.
Goddamn right. Amen. Trying to get emotional here. All right, folks. It has been a wonderful long evening. I'm going to have Professor Richardson, with my indulgence, please read this passage. But before that, I do want to thank Sixth and I for hosting yet another wonderful event. Just the staff here is amazing. I really, really, truly love this venue. It's been my favorite venue for, 15 years now, and I just love coming here. And I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and celebrating democracy with us and preparing for a new, vibrant, wonderful chapter in the history of this country. So thank you for coming tonight. Professor Richardson, would you mind reading that?
Just the paragraph?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can read more if you want. It's your book event.
The true history of American democracy is that it is never finished. It is the story of people who have honored the idea that a nation can be based not in land or religion or race or hierarchies, but rather in the concept of human equality. That commitment, along with its corollary, that we have a right to consent to our government, which in turn should act in our interest, has brought us our powerful history of people working and sacrificing to bring those principles to life. Reclaiming our history of noble struggle reworks the polarizing language that has done us such disservice while it undermines the ideology of authoritarianism.
Friends, Professor Heather Cox Richardson.
Thank you. And Charlotte Clymer.
Stop, guys.
Now we're hooked. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.